Welcome today to Kairos Conversations. Today we're going to be talking about Ephesians chapter 4 and the list of roles within the church that Paul mentions there. Like he says, Christ gave the church apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry. Does Paul envision that shepherds and teachers are two different roles, or are they the same role? Let's find out as we talk about this together. Welcome back today to Kairos Conversations. I'm Courtney, the resident Hebrew enthusiast, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Ryan Martin, the New Testament Greek guy. So, how are you doing today, Ryan?
I'm doing great. How are you, Courtney?
I'm doing great. If you're not familiar with Kairos Conversations, no matter your background, if you're just interested in digging deeper into your Bible, you want to know a little bit about Greek or Hebrew grammar, ancient Near Eastern culture, feel free to join us as we discover the world of the Bible through the original languages. Today, like I mentioned in the intro, we are looking at Ephesians chapter 4 to see, does Paul distinguish between these roles of pastor and teacher? This is a question that kind of comes up a lot in church settings. And so Ryan's here today to help us look at the Greek and see if we should distinguish or if they are, in fact, the same role. So Ryan, how has this text normally been read and interpreted?
Yeah, and in a couple of very interesting ways that I want us to kind of paint the spectrum here before we get too deep into our conversation. Let's look at the text before we start parsing it out. So we have, and he gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and teachers. Some of these words are great cognates for early Greek learners. We have apostolus for apostles, prophetas for prophets. Sounds similar, right? And these are the people, these are the roles that Christ gave to the church because he loves the church and wants the church to be strong and well supported. But our question here, if I can highlight the end kind of more controversial or where there's different diverging interpretations here, has to do with these shepherds and teachers. Are these two separate roles? Or are these two ways of describing the same person, the same role? You may be familiar with Alan Hirsch and the APEST assessment. This is basically like a Christian leadership strength finder, right? Like, what are you? Are you an apostle? Are you a prophet? Are you an evangelist? Are you a pastor? Are you a teacher? These kind of five roles, the typical fivefold ministry kind of theological categories, right? Obviously, this paradigm depends on Paul talking about two different kinds of people here, pastors or shepherds, right? And then teachers, right? So this is one way that we could break this up.
Yeah, I think even though I'd never personally heard of that assessment until we were talking about this, I think that there is this distinguishing marker within the church that people just might have naturally. You know, they might say of their pastor, like, oh, he's a great pastor, but he's not a good teacher. Or he's a great teacher, but he's not a good pastor, meaning like he can really teach the Bible, but he's maybe not so good on the interpersonal skills or being good for you in a time of crisis, or vice versa, right? And so I think people kind of naturally have these as like separated categories in their head, even if they're not thinking like fivefold ministry, like our church needs a fivefold ministry, right?
For sure. I do think that's an assumption. I mean, here we have a list, right? We have a list of stuff, and there's two of the last things. Well, there's another interpretation, too, that often leans on something called the Granville Sharp rule. We'll talk in a minute about whether that's a fair use of the Granville Sharp rule. But basically, just to say that you see how we have the prophets, the evangelists, the apostles, and then we have just the shepherds and teachers. There's no the before teachers, right? There's kind of a grammatical case here, possibly, for saying that shepherds and teachers are actually the same in Paul's mind right here. That it's like Paul saying apostles, prophets, evangelists, and then like shepherd teachers or teaching shepherds. They're kind of like one role with just these two things describing it. So that would be the total other way of reading this text.
Right. And that's one of those situations where our English translation is actually really good at showing us where that article is actually there in Greek. Because there's only one article for both of these two words in Greek, right?
Yep, that is exactly true. And that's where we need to bring up this thing called the Granville Sharp rule. Now, you may have heard of this specifically in discussions about the deity of Christ. There's a couple of key places in the New Testament where the Granville Sharp rule is an interesting thing to bring to that conversation. We'll do a video on that sometime in the future. But just here very generally, what the Granville Sharp rule is the idea that when you have one article, one the, before two nouns that are separated by the word and, so like the A and B, right? The A and B, that kind of construction, that if that's going on, then the two nouns have the same reference. In other words, they're talking about the same thing, just using two different words to describe or to name that same thing, right? So that is like the most broad, that's the Granville Sharp rule. But what people often don't know is that there's actually some really important conditions to the Granville Sharp rule. In other words, it only works, it's only obviously true if a few things are also true. Like both nouns have to be singular, right? If the two nouns are plural, or if either of them are plural, the Granville Sharp rule does not hold. We're not necessarily talking about the same thing. Also, if either of them are a proper name, like a proper noun, I guess we would say, then it also doesn't hold. So you might be looking at that singular part and saying, I see what's going on here. I see where the rub is, right? In this particular text, right? He gave what? He gave shepherds and teachers, plural. So actually, the Granville Sharp rule does not technically apply here.
Yeah, so just to summarize and make sure I'm getting this clearly, Ryan, it's if we were using this Granville Sharp rule, it would need to be two singular nouns joined by one article in front. And so we almost have it. We have one article in front, but it's two plural nouns. So we can't say this is a clear-cut case of Granville Sharp rule. And if we were saying that it could work, then that's where we would have pastor teachers or teacher pastors, right? So that would be where it's one role. But if the Granville Sharp rule is not in play, that's where we could distinguish maybe between these as a fivefold ministry and not a fourfold ministry, right?
Yeah, exactly. I couldn't have said that better myself. This is, if the Granville Sharp rule is holding here, then Paul's listing four things. And if not, it doesn't necessarily, this is like converse, inverse, confusing logic stuff, right? It's not that right. It's not that if the Granville Sharp rule doesn't apply, that it's definitely separate. It's just that we can't use the Granville Sharp rule to show that it is identical. So you're absolutely right. But there is still one article, right? I mean, we still have, if I can pull the passage back up here, we still do have an article before each of the other offices here. The apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, and then the shepherds and teachers. So Paul still might be envisioning these two in at least related categories, even if not completely different, even if not completely the same, even if not the same role, he still might be grouping these together in the list.
Yeah. So if you were grouping them together, how does that fit with the overall New Testament picture? How might that work in our local church gatherings? Those are some of the questions that are still lingering in my head. Yeah.
Well, hopefully all of us are in the habit of when we run into challenges in our interpretation of the Bible, letting the Bible interpret the Bible. That's a good thing, right? Let's look at the way, and we'll just even stick with Paul. Paul writing to Timothy. Look at two different places within that letter here. In chapter 3, Paul says, therefore an overseer, episkopon, right, where we get our episcopal or episcopacy word in English, must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, and able to teach, right? So, again, what's the relationship between a shepherd in our Ephesians passage and an episcopal here? Big question when we don't have time for today. But still, we have teaching kind of under the umbrella of of the rule of an overseer here, right?
Teaching and being hospitable.
Teaching and being hospitable.
So maybe both of those in that one description there. Yeah.
Totally, absolutely. We got both of these for overseers. Looking a few chapters later, chapter 5 of 1 Timothy, we get elders. Let the elders who rule be well considered, worthy of double honor, especially those who are laboring in preaching and teaching. So we almost see, you see how hard it is to get, the roles with these different offices, and, if you try to parse it out really in these nice, neat categories, it really is complicated. But I think we can at least say that teaching is kind of woven within this bigger picture of many of the different roles that Paul envisions for the church. So if it is kind of a little bit like these correlations are kind of there, but not super solid, and he sees these things together, but not the same thing, there's other precedent for this within the New Testament.
Yeah, so what is his overall intention? Like, how would you say that we should think about, there's only one article on pastors and teachers, or shepherd teachers. How should we think about
Yeah. I actually kind of like the midpoint here. If I can look at those two extremes and try to shoot the middle. If my wife is at the grocery store and she calls me and says, hey, do we need anything? I might be like, hey, yeah, we need eggs, we need bread, we need milk, and we need salt and pepper. Right? Now, when I said salt and pepper there, that's like salt is not pepper, pepper is not salt. Those are two different things. But they were grouped together in my list, like, on purpose. Like, it makes sense that I wouldn't say, oh, we need pepper and eggs and milk and salt. Like, it makes more sense that I would put them together. I think that's the kind of thing that's going on here. There's one article before shepherds and teachers, and I think that makes sense just because of the many places in the New Testament that you find these different roles or gifts or whatever together. But no, I don't think, and I definitely don't think the Granville Sharp rule is in effect here. This is not a Granville Sharp construction.
Right.
So we cannot grammatically say that they are the same. So I'd say related, but distinct in a certain way.
Right. And so maybe if I were like thinking in my local church context, would it be good to say that if someone who's better at shepherding, like our pastoral care pastor, for instance, he might also need to be able to teach. And our teaching pastor might also need to be able to shepherd. Like, these are not mutually exclusive roles, that they kind of do go hand in hand together.
Not mutually exclusive at all. And Paul clearly sees some overlap in these types of offices. So, yeah, I think that'd be wise.
Well, I really enjoyed this conversation today, Ryan. It's really always exciting to be able to see the Bible in its own terms and the language it was written in. And I hope our audience enjoyed it as well. If you did enjoy it, comment below and tell us what you think and how this tends to work out in your own local church context. We know there's tons of different denominations out there, and kind of the roles tend to depend on your denomination. So let us know what you think. And always do the YouTube thing, like, subscribe, share. And we love to take questions from our students. A lot of these are questions from people in our own lives that ask us these things. So if you want to ask us questions, feel free to do that, and we might cover it in a future video. So it was great seeing you guys today, and we look forward to seeing you again here at Kairos Conversations.